My work has been very different over time. And when I first started doing this, I've always been doing some combination of biology and social science since my teen years. And what I've come to do since I've done my PhD and went out and started to work, I worked at ECRAF, the International Council for Research in Agroforestry in Kenya. And what I did essentially was to turn into a kind of a political ecologist without a license. I discovered that as a geographer, I knew I wanted to do both ecological work and critical social science work and critical work on culture. But I started running into some people's work that wasn't even being called political ecology then. Now they're some of the big names in the field. And I decided, yeah, that's what I am. I'm a political ecologist. They weren't even calling themselves that. They were too Marxist to claim that name, but they claim it now. And the founding father thinks very attractive, so that they claim it. And I claimed it, and then eventually I was out in the field, which is somebody else's home place in Kenya, trying to do field work with an institution that had a board that didn't want to let it do field work. I had this 2-year postdoc. I had to do something, so I went out to a place where they were studying methodologies to do agroforestry and do research with farmers. And on that methodology pretext, I was able to start what became a 10-year relationship with people in that place, learning about what they did in their landscape with trees, learning about the way that they combined trees, crops, animals, all kinds of different practices, different livelihoods. And eventually I started learning about their history, and surprise, in sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of the agricultural labor at that time was being done by women. My colleagues were working with 10 families, and 9 out of their 10 collaborators were men, I thought. And the other one was somebody's wife, and they were really working with him. But then she ended up being the one that really knew more about the farming. So I thought, right, gender. So we really need to deal with this. I need to deal with women. So I started out trying to first to understand it, and then to make women's work and women's knowledge and women's interests in these landscapes that were kind of targets of development by the Kenyan state and many international agencies and environmental agencies and so forth. Try to make women's work and interest and knowledge visible, and then eventually I realized I needed to make it, on the one hand, legible, but also to help make legible to them the processes that were coming at them, and to discuss those with them and not just take their knowledge as bits of information, but their analyses, their understandings of who they were, what they were doing, what they were after. So I ended up being, some days an ecologist and some days an anthropologist and always a geographer. I'm still there. That's what I do, and I do it a lot in landscapes that have farms and forests, that have conservation and development activities and mandates and empires rolling around with people, and sometimes increasingly people involved with social movements or with local organizations that are kind of recommoning the landscape or reasserting their own knowledge and their own visions and their rights to that in the landscape. One of the things that I'm doing right now is writing about land grabbing, and in fact a conference here in, I believe, 2011 on land grabbing was the occasion for me to draft a paper which has just been published in one of the issues of Peasant Studies that they featured yesterday in the book fair. And the thing I did there, my friends call it in Spanish a denuncio académico, an academic denouncement. And a lot of the social movements and the autonomous press, the independent press, they do these denuncios, these denouncements, partly as a way to protect people from the kind of repression that's gotten a journalist and a human rights worker from Veracruz killed in Mexico City about a month ago. The kind of thing that's gotten young people who stood up and took a leadership role in resisting a great big new industrial strength tourism development in Chiapas. 3 of them were killed while I was writing the article about what was happening to them and their response to it. All unarmed, all nonviolent, none engaging in any illegal activity. And what I realized was that I was interested in being in Chiapas and helping people. They tell us to stop it, okay? But that's what I started out interested in, helping people to develop kind of new agroforestry systems, new agricultural and forest landscapes based on where they're at now, the situation they're in, and they are in a struggle to sort that out. On the other hand, when they found out I could write these political ecology pieces, which they called academic denouncements, they thought that was pretty interesting and useful. So I proceeded to formalize that, and I've just written a paper, and it's about the way that the land grab, which in some places is about supposedly failed or very weak states. It's about one wealthy person buying up 10,000 to 100,000 to 500,000 hectares at a shot. And it's all about the purchases. Well, as it turned out in Chiapas, it's territorial. And it's being facilitated by a strong and now increasingly militarized state. And it's cleansing the forest for the private investors who don't have to make big purchases, who can come in and take little pieces of land and become a node in a whole territory that has been reclassified and recoded, whose people have been reclassified and recoded, and many of them sent off. Except that there is this resistance there. And it's been effective for 15 years. The project hasn't started, and the people are still on their land, or at least in the region, if not occupying the very same space. So that's one thing that I'm doing. The other thing is writing some things about new ecologies, about emergent ecologies. One of my colleagues, Wendy Harcourt, just called them queer ecologies. We're talking about looking at assemblages of people, plants, animals, things, artifacts that come together in a place and they're an item, but it's not legible to the scientists, it's not legible to policymakers, often not visible. And so part of the work I do now, and I'm now combing through data sets that I've been putting together for 20 years because now there's some scope to publish them. I'm talking about emergent ecologies, new ecologies that in one case we have a regional agroforest that is full of indigenous tree species from the, quote, original forest, right? And nobody was trying to make policy to foster that, to save it, to expand it, even though it does so many of the things that the so-called original forest did. So I'm busy writing that work up from Machacos and Kitui districts in Kenya, from a place in central Dominican Republic, from a second city of almost 1 million people in the Dominican Republic, and now in Mexico, you know, looking at these peasant ecologies, indigenous peoples' ecologies, but I also look at urban ecologies, peri-urban ecologies, and also develop tools that other people can use to go out and quantify these things, to see them, to name them, to quantify them, to appreciate them, so that we're not all held hostage to World Wildlife or Conservation International's idea of what's a real ecology worth saving. I've been working for a long time doing what I and some others decided to call feminist political ecology, and it kind of took hold. And then we all focused on women, on making women visible with respect to environment, right? We focused on making more legible to women in many places the gendered nature of environmental policy and the environments in which they were operating and the distribution of resources and authority over them and so forth. We also went a long way to begin to use the entry point of women's lives and thinking about gender, but often just starting from women's lives and looking at the ways in which knowledge was gendered, the ways in which authority over land and plants and animals was gendered, the way in which distribution of access to things and the products of work and so forth were gendered. And eventually, in many places, we found these very complicated gendered tenure regimes, and there was tree tenure, and a woman might own a tree on the land of her husband, or one woman in a family that was polygamous with 3 wives would have land that belonged to her, and the crops that she raised were hers, and she had her own crop store. And then her husband would have dibs on her labor in his plot. There might be a tree in his plot that she tended, and she was therefore the rightful owner of the fruit. We began to map out things like that, and it helped us to just see a complex commons, complex tenure, resource tenure beyond land tenure, and a very complex commons. and something you couldn't put a polygon around. You couldn't just draw a boundary and say, this belongs to you, this belongs to him. So we went from doing that, many of us went from doing that with women, about women and gender, and we just started looking at landscapes that way and looking at all the interest groups in the space that way. And I think we went from just being able to see a landscape that belonged to a family, or some people would have said a household head, to a landscape with all of these multiple dimensions of elements in it and tenure relations that were gendered, to complex tenure relations among many different groupings of people, to the complex commons. And so it isn't just, well, this is common, that's public, this is private, but beginning to see elements of public, private, and common interests in and authority over many different kinds of commons. And from there, what I would say is one of the things that I would like to see feminism embrace, and I think could be informed quite a bit by feminist experience, is recommoning. People taking over public plazas, people standing on their land and refusing to let go of it, people creating new commons in the countryside. I think that recommonings can gain a lot from the knowledge and experience of feminist movements and feminist thought. And I think that feminists can gain quite a lot and could contribute something very important by participating in that process. One is this feminist issue that many of us have been dealing with for quite a long time, and it's part of what we do in feminist political ecology. With lots of people, we do lots of things, and we're purposely quite broad and quite flexible, and we're learning from each other all the time, right? But one of the things that we do in feminist political ecology is to look at identity and look at multiple identities. These are kind of phases in feminism, right, in feminist theory. And also then to look at the way that most of us are simultaneously coming from and in the process of creating multiple identities. And I like to think of it as a network, and there are all these little nodes. And I tell my students, you know, if I go to Harvard, my class node it lights right up. I really remember where I come from when I go to Harvard. And if I walk into a room full of men, my little feminist light's just right there, you know. So we're thinking about multiple dimensions, multiple elements of identity, and the way that those affect when we're as individuals and then in interaction with various groupings, how our interests in something like landscape might be different. Our attachments to some animals and not others. Our interest in some activities like voyeuristic tourism versus hunting, you know. Our interest in the continuing maintenance of that landscape or a radical transformation in it. They're conditioned by gender, class, religion, personal history, sexuality. All kinds of things go into making up who is this person that's got this stake in this thing. So when they talk about stakeholders, that's like, oh, we've got this group, we've got that group, and they're not dealing with the complexity of individuals and groups and the flux and dynamism over time in the things that those groups care about, that matter to them, that could be life and death for them, or that might have been important yesterday and they're not going to be tomorrow. So those kinds of things I think are not well understood. And the other problem with the stakeholder business, I think of a bunch of guys with a skewer with a steak on it. And then there's those people with the little meatball and the lady with the tofu and the person with the empty skewer, you know. And so, and usually it's the real stakeholders that make it to those tables. And when the other people go, the rules and the format are the rules and the format of those stakeholders. So they get to feel small in a place that's not theirs. They get to feel voiceless in a place where their voice doesn't have resonance, you know. And so there's that whole business about difference, right? So that's one. The other one is about within ecology, this business of emergent ecologies, that there are these very vibrant new ecologies that are not being valued, and if you don't value them, you can't protect them, or you can't help people to optimize the production of something in it that they might really need to keep going. And so a lot of what's being done, there's a lot of quantification, there's a lot of classification, there's a lot of reduction, abstraction, But what there isn't enough of is what I would call radical empiricism, that you go out and you look around and you be inductive, not deductive. You be inductive, you scope around and you see what's actually there, you see who is there, and you begin visiting different standpoints, different perspectives based on different beings in that landscape to try and understand what are the relationships. So we get a lot of boxes, we get a lot of categories. We don't get a lot of relationship, and the ones that we get are things that are coming from a top-down vision and from a single place, some postulated neutral place that I believe does not exist. So what's missing is being able to convene conversations, to work on scenarios, to work through questions where you visit lots of different perspectives by social group, by species, by livelihood group, you name it, or by urban versus rural, all those things. So how the heck are we going to govern a planet if we can't even convene a group of people to have a really deeply democratic conversation about something? Right now, I think everybody agrees that we're at a point in history where we have a lot of decisions out there, and there are various crises. I wouldn't deny them. It's a little scary because sometimes we let the crisis push us into a quick fix, and we take a road that we can't turn back from. We make a lot of mistakes. We throw a lot of people under the bus, a lot of species under the bus, right? But because there is this sense right now that's starting to be more shared, I went to the People's Climate Convergence in New York City. I had been years before, 2010, I went to the Cancun meetings to the Alternative Via Campesina Forum. At that forum, I thought, oh my God, I will never see this in my country. I will never see people who are doing racial justice, indigenous politics, women's rights politics, human rights politics, environmental conservation, sustainable development. I will never see them all in one place. This is so heartening, but I'll never see this. And in New York City, last year, in September, they were all there. The indigenous and the environmental justice communities, basically communities of color from the United States, including indigenous from the United States, led the march. They were many. The NAACP had a climate justice officer present. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People has an office of climate justice. Woo. This, for me, there's a moment of convergence here that I had never expected to see. And I was in the street with people from children's schools who went to the climate march, their parents, their teachers. I ran into people I'd known from years back, and one of the environmental justice organizations hung out a big banner. A group from a black high school marched down the street with their band and joined us at an intersection, and I just thought, this is it. So that's the opportunity I see, that we can even say the word climate justice right now is actually quite something. So I feel like we're at a moment and a place where there are enough people who've come to the table, and they're not just against something, but they're critical, and they're very much for doing a whole set of things. And there are perhaps, I hope, enough people in positions of power willing to listen. If not, we'll have to do it without them. But it would be nice if they'd make it easier. I would say that speaking to people who are doing resource politics or see themselves as operating in that sphere and addressing the kind of issues that we have here at this conference, from climate change to water, to land issues, to biodiversity, all those things, that what I really want to see us do is to recognize the fact, right, not of the Anthropocene. That's big, and it's becoming an umbrella and an alibi for a lot of things that might run amok or go astray. Not the Anthropocene, but that can allow us to see ourselves as living beings in a world of living beings, and in a world of other persons, as persons in a world of many kinds of persons, and that we begin to do our environmental science, our ecology, our God help us, natural resource management, which carries all kinds of baggage, that we do that coming from that premise that we stop tomorrow evicting people from their landscapes, their coastal zones, their coral reefs, etc., to protect them from small artisanal producers and communities that have been there in that space, and put blinders on the sides of our eyes and not call out global capitalism. So I really want to see us dismantle global capitalism just like peeling the layers of an onion. It's a rotten onion. We just keep peeling till it's gone. We can't smell it anymore, and we figure out who we're going to be. And we stop displacing people who are already doing a pretty good job of being from their places in the world where they're still connected.